Next bill is House Bill 48 by Representative Duplesis, relative to identification cards issued by post-secondary education institutions to require post-secondary education governing authorities to ensure ID cards contain certain information. And on behalf of the Bureau, Representative Horton sends up technical amendments.
Without objection. Representative Duplesis on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, as you know, current Louisiana law requires us to show a valid ID for voting purposes. This body, several years ago, required that four-year state secondary institutions ensure that the student IDs have a signature on them. All this bill would do is extend that to include technical colleges and community colleges, as well as private and independent universities.
All right, we have a question on the bill. Representative Edmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did have a couple of questions. So of the institutions that have currently under providing the card that can be used to vote,
Yes.
Are they responsible for collecting the data now? And of the two institutions that you're adding, will they follow the same guidelines? Is that what you're proposing?
Yes, sir.
And so can you tell us a little bit about what happens, what a university does to follow through on that the students are still enrolled, that they don't just come in as a freshman and they quit and then really it's not a valid ID anymore, any of that?
So that would be a little more technical than I might be able to provide an answer on, Rep. Edmonds, in terms of students leaving the university and whether or not they come back. Each school can have its own process in terms of how they go about it. But all this is requiring that they do is ensure that the signature be added to the ID. That's all the schools are required to do. How they go about doing that is totally up to them.
And so if a student starts as a freshman and stays 2 semesters, they would still be able to use the card because it would still be valid, I would assume. Is that?
You mean use it for the purposes of their education?
No,
okay.
For voting, because that's the crux of your bill, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah,
so we're making sure that we got a valid person with a valid ID.
Yes.
That person then is, that's a 4 year, the original bill, or the original,
yes,
where
sir.
we are currently, it's 4 years.
Right.
So you've expanded that to 6 years.
Yes.
And in that 6-year time period, it either expires when they conclude their studies,
mm-hmm.
or the actual date expires. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And so do you see that problematic in any way for the Secretary of State's office or register of voters to be able to have a valid ID for that 6-year time period?
Not necessarily, because the law, if you read the law, to vote, it just requires the language in the law says a generally recognizable identification. So we have decided as a state that student IDs are generally identifiable identification as long as it has that signature on it. So whether they're in school or not in school, it would be up to that local registrar or polling place to look at it, look at the person, and determine whether or not it's an actual valid ID that was issued on the date in which
so the expansion to 6 years and these other institutions, do you have the support of the Secretary of State's office?
I didn't get any opposition, so I didn't get any opposition on it.
No opposition, but no. Actually, they're not affirming the bill either.
They didn't weigh in on it. It's really the local clerks and those who administer at the local level who will be dealing with it, but they didn't weigh in on it.
Registrar of voters they're not in support. They'd be in the same way, right?
I don't know how it would affect them. I don't know how it would affect them because they're already taking IDs. I mean, under current law, all it's doing is they're just including more universities. I don't know how it would change anything that the Secretary of State's office is already doing.
And the universities that you're adding, you're confident of their collection of their data?
I am. Yeah, because it's already been working.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, question on the bill, Representative Bacala.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Duplessis, this is a mandate for something the colleges are now going to be required to do, correct?
Yes.
And the mandate includes that they shall issue a permanent ID to a student with the expiration date being their anticipated graduation date or a 6-year window. I think it's the lesser, whichever occurs first,
Whichever
correct?
occurs first, that's correct.
Now look, it's been a long time since I went to college, but my college ID allowed me to check out books in the library, attend football games, and all sorts of things. Do you think that might still be the case where issuing someone a student ID, which does not expire for, let's just use 4 years, and they're a student for 1 semester, yet they still have a valid, unexpired university ID, do you think that could create some complications for on-campus privileges?
No, I think we're turning it into something that doesn't exist. This is already law. This is already law.
Well, I don't think the law requires them to issue an ID that's good for up to 6 years and
Well,
say
it's
it doesn't
4.
expire for 6 years.
4 years. So I was asked to change it from 4 to 6, Representative Bacala, by one of the private institutions because they said that there are a lot of programs that go beyond 4 years. So this would help them. So if you have a master's program or if you're in a 4-year program but you end up spending 6 years there, then you wouldn't have to get a new ID issued. So this is already law.
Well, are you telling me it's law that a university has to issue an ID to a kid that shows up on campus for the first day of his college education, and that ID cannot expire for 6 years or 4 years?
Well, I'm not saying what the university has to do. What I'm saying is if they issue an ID, it should have a signature on it. So when they issue it is up to the university. I don't know that they issued on the first day.
I have no problem with that part. I'm asking, you're saying they shall issue an ID which will not expire until the anticipated graduation date or 6 years,
Right.
whichever is lesser.
Right.
So that, since that ID does not expire, it means a non-college student will continue to have a valid, unexpired college ID. And I look, going back again, it's been a long time since I've been to college. We used to get one every semester. You would issue a new ID that shows you're a current student. And I wonder if we're not, and I think that is not current law. It's telling them from now on, you can't issue a 1-semester ID or a 1-year ID. You have to issue a 4 or 6 year ID.
I don't think it limits them. I don't think that not my read of it, Representative Bacala. I don't think it limits them from being able to issue a new one. If they want to issue a new one,
Let me read your language. It says, such an identification card, the required issued card, shall expire on the anticipated date of the student's graduation or program completion or on the date 6 years subsequent to the date the card is issued. So when the card is issued, it does not expire for that extended period of time, which means it continues to look like a valid college ID, even though they might not be in college anymore.
But again, that's an expiration date. Just like if you and I get a driver's license or a state issue ID, we can go get that tomorrow. It'll last for 6 years. What you and I do in between that time is we're not prohibited from going and get a new ID if we want.
But again, my driver's license doesn't allow me library privileges at LSU. So LSU or your private institutions, that ID card is valid for purposes related to the college or university.
Okay.
I mean, it may be shopping in the union or whatever it is. I just wonder if we're not.
This is something that the college has asked for, the 6 year change. The college asked for from the 4 to 6 year change.
Which college?
Tulane University.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Question on the bill, Representative Amity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Duplessis, can you just confirm for the record some of the things we talked about in committee before, in that this bill in no way changes how a person qualifies to be a registered voter.
That is correct.
It
It
simply,
changes absolutely nothing.
okay. And under current law, you can already use a college ID as your ID when you go to vote.
That's correct.
So this simply allows community and technical colleges and private universities to also provide an ID that's eligible for voting?
That is absolutely correct. That's all the bill does.
Okay. I know that people were concerned that somehow we were expanding voting eligibility. But thank you.
Representative Thomas for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Duplessis, I had a question after I thought about this a little bit more. Because our universities have people from out of state, what safeguard is there for voting in two different places?
So, yeah, we talked about that. I mean, it's the same thing that would apply when people move from state to state, right?
I'm sorry, I can't hear
I said
you.
the same thing would apply for folks who move from state to state. So if you've once lived in another state, you move to Louisiana to register to vote, I believe there are systems that are already in place that will cross-check to ensure that you're not registered somewhere else. So if you register here, there are systems that can check to make sure you're
I
not
don't
registered.
think that exists.
Well, that's what I was told by my registrar of voters. So maybe that's what I was told, so that's what I believe from my registrar of voters.
Okay, so this
So the same-
doesn't, there's no safeguard for that built in here, nor can there be.
But again, Rep. Thomas, this deals absolutely nothing with voter registration. This has nothing to do with voter registration.
No, I wasn't asking about voter
Yes.
registration. I was asking about voting. What is to prevent someone from out of state or out of the city or out of a parish from voting in two different places?
I think that does deal with voter registration. I'm not sure I understand the question as it applies to the bill.
Well, if a student, you said Tulane asked for this. Tulane has an awful lot of out-of-state students. So if someone from Connecticut is a Tulane student, what is to prevent that student, or what safeguard is there that the student does not vote both in Louisiana and in Connecticut?
I just told you what I thought they were, and you disagreed with it. But
Okay,
I will
yeah,
say this, but
'cause
I will say this.
I'm not aware of it. If
Right.
you can,
But this is what I'll say.
if you know about it, I'd really like to learn about
This is
it.
what I'll say. Whatever safeguards are currently in place for, if, say, an LSU student, because this is already the law. If an LSU student is from Connecticut and they vote in Connecticut, but they move to Louisiana to go to LSU and they want to vote in two different places, the same safeguards that we have in place to stop that would affect a student at Tulane. All this is doing is expanding it to private colleges. This is already the law. This is already the law. The law already requires for state-issued student IDs to have a signature. So it's not changing anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question on the bill, Representative Phelps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Representative Amity brought up some of the comments that we talked about in the committee. I'd like to again thank you for bringing the bill, because there are students now, colleges, community colleges, that only issue one ID per their term that's at the school, as well as did you know that's only just a form of ID, because if that person is not registered, they will not be able to use that additional form of ID.
Correct.
Thank you so much for your bill to help the students that are currently trying to register or
Thank you.
vote here while they're in college. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question on the bill, Representative Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you also, Representative, for bringing the bill. I think I'm hearing a lot of things that seems to be a little misguided. When you register in college, they're going to give you an ID for that semester, or at most for that year, is what I understand the case to be. Is that right?
That could be the case. I think it depends on that college university. They might issue you one each year. They might issue you one for your entire term of being there, and they might just update it. I think it depends on that institution for them to
Right,
decide.
but that registration is going, that ID is going to be tied to your registration in school.
In school,
So you're going to be a student with that ID.
yes.
You shouldn't be getting a student ID, be it for the full term or the semester, unless you've actually registered as a student in school.
Yeah, I would, yes.
All right, and so this bill is not necessarily allowing someone that's not a student to still be able to use a student ID for registration. You're going to have to be a student.
That's not the goal. But again, the law says generally recognizable IDs. That's what Louisiana law currently allows for. So a student ID would qualify as such.
Right. Well, I would think that, you know, if the person had the ID, there's an expiration date on the ID, that there are obviously some safeguards there, that this is a student and it's been issued as a part of their registration in school. I don't think we are seeing a scenario where you have someone that wasn't registered in college also having a student ID. So
That's correct.
I think you got the safeguards in place.
Yeah, it's,
Thank you, Representative.
It's already law.
Representative Ivy for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I may have missed it in the beginning working on something else. Why are you bringing this bill?
I was asked to bring it by some college students.
And for what purpose? What problem were they trying to solve?
So right now, the law currently requires state four-year post-secondary institutions to include the ID. The purpose would be
To include the ID?
I'm sorry, the signature on the ID.
Okay.
Thank you. This would require the independent private colleges as well as the community and technical colleges. That's the purpose of it. Just to include the ID. I'm sorry, the signature on the ID. That's all it would do.
Okay. Are you also now including private universities in this as well?
Yes.
Okay. And for clarification, because I haven't had a chance to pull the laws that govern the ID requirements for voting, can a private institution provide an ID and that ID be used for voting ID purposes?
Under this law, but
well,
the law says
under current law right
under
now.
current law, any generally recognizable identification. So
Is that
would
usually generally recognizable government issued ID?
well, under current law, state post-secondary education institutions are not government. I wouldn't consider those to be government institutions.
They're controlled. They're part of the executive branch of government, state government.
Well, and that's part of what also led to this as well, because these schools get state funding. So community and technical colleges, as well as the private schools, so they receive state funding.
Right. I believe if we include private universities, let's say, I don't know what the requirements are to become, quote, a private university, but could they not just issue these things somewhat haphazardly or, fraudulently? And how is someone at a polling location supposed to determine if and some of these may be very small colleges, how are they supposed to determine that that's a valid ID?
The same procedures that they use right now.
But I mean, if it's from the Louisiana State University, they
Right.
know who that is.
Right,
If
but
it's from Southeastern or Southern,
Sure.
or pick a state university, everyone is familiar with our, quote, public universities.
Well, I think that's an assumption. I think there's an assumption that everyone is familiar with Louisiana Tech or Southeastern or some of your state schools. I think that's an assumption. The law says generally recognizable identifications. Does
it say government issued?
No, it does not. It does not say government issued. It does not say government issued. And
Okay, does it require a signature to be on
Yes.
the ID?
It does.
Okay.
And that's the purpose of the bill, because it does require a signature. But a
Okay.
generally recognizable ID is what the Louisiana state law
Would you
says.
consider an amendment to remove private universities
That-
out of the...
That would defeat the whole purpose of my bill, Representative Ivy. I mean, that would defeat the whole purpose of the bill.
Are
our
public universities already required to have a signature on the bill?
the 4 years are.
Okay. Are those IDs also required to be valid IDs when they're presented?
What do you mean by valid?
Like not expired?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
If it's
Your driver's license, I believe,
Yeah.
it can be expired, correct?
I don't know if that's correct or not. It might be, but I don't know.
I believe if it's a state-issued ID, it may be,
Yeah.
it can be expired and still be valid for people who don't drive anymore, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern is that we're expanding something which may no longer be relevant if they're not a college student, like the 4-year to 6-year thing. I think it's problematic. When comparing it to the driver's license, there's an assumption and a higher likelihood that someone's going to be a Louisiana driver, and there's also the ability for law enforcement who actually asks for your driver's license when they're on the road. They can actually validate whether or not that license is valid. There's no ability for a polling individual to validate whether something is valid, if someone's actually a student or not, and extending it for 6 years, I believe, is problematic as well. Did you know?
Again, thank you. I appreciate that. I do understand your position. But again, under current law, whatever tools are used to validate or to say that an ID is valid or not valid, if it's an ID for someone who attends Southern or someone who attends Louisiana Tech, that same process would be put in place.
Okay, one of the things you change in here is Title 18, Section 562, Paragraph A to A1 or I. So, what are those provisions that are being required beyond the signature? What other ID security features are now being required? Are we enhancing the security requirements, or are we reducing those security features?
I apologize, Rep. Ivy. Can you repeat your question?
Line 20 on page 1.
Line 21, page 1.
No, line 20 on
Line
page
20.
1.
So the addition, that actually was the only feedback I got from the Secretary of State's office on this bill. They asked that I include 1309 because that deals with early voting, so that these cards would be recognized at early voting. So that was the only feedback I got from the Secretary of State's office. They asked that I include that, so I agreed to it.
Okay, I'll look at that. I will. So you would not accept an amendment to remove the private institutions?
Respectfully, I can't, because it was students from private universities and institutions that asked me to bring the bill.
Well,
so it would defeat the entire purpose of the bill.
What about an employer who has an ID that meets all the requirements and includes a signature on the photo ID for any corporation in our state? Would that be acceptable?
An employer?
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna use Exxon. They're down the street from us. So Exxon Corporation, they have a photo ID, meets all the security requirements, and it has the signature on the ID. Would that be an acceptable form of ID to present at the polling location?
So you would have to ask someone a little bit more expert on this. But what I'll do is I'll read the law for you word for word. Okay. Louisiana law for prerequisites for voting. Okay. A Louisiana driver's license, a Louisiana special identification card, or other generally recognized picture identification card that contains the name and the signature of the applicant. That is the law. Now, if you ask my personal opinion, I don't think we should need IDs at all.
So you're saying that the law's a little vague on what is, quote, generally acceptable ID?
Exactly.
Does anywhere, because I don't have it before me, does it stay state issued or government issued ID?
Only it's everything I just said.
That's it. Okay.
A Louisiana
everything
driver's license, a special ID, or any other generally recognized picture identification. So if I show up and I don't have an ID, what do? Or what do? You sign an affidavit. Okay? You sign an affidavit. So we can, this discussion of what is a generally acceptable.
In lieu of signing an affidavit, someone could fraudulently fabricate an ID card with the signature from.
I don't know. I think we're kind of getting off the reservation.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Representative Jefferson for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Duplessis, I think a lot has been bantered and said as it relates to this. You were asked to bring this from the private institutions, right?
That's correct.
And they contribute mightily, those institutions and their students throughout the state of Louisiana. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Do they pay taxes? Do our students frequent various avenues where they're able to provide for the local economy?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And it's not just the privates, but you're also expanding it also to the technical institutions, community colleges, correct?
Yes.
And all of us have technical or community colleges in our districts or what have you, right?
Yes, sir.
And the various private institutions, how many are there in the state of Louisiana?
I think it's 10.
Okay. Are you familiar with Dillard?
Very.
Familiar with Xavier?
Very.
Newcomb? Tulane?
Yes.
Okay. Those institutions that asked you, they got together, they said this would be a good tool for them to assist something that's already in the law. Mm-hmm. Do you have any evidence? Because a lot of questions, a lot of queries were, mentioned about fraud or anything like that. Has LSU had any problems with this?
No, not that I'm aware of. And that's actually a great point that I point out. This has already been the law at least for 4 years. I'm not aware of any issues that have occurred since this has been the law. And just for the record, schools would not be required to comply with this for at least 2 years. They would have 2 years to come into compliance with this. So it would obviously have no impact on the current upcoming election. So they would have 2 years to come into compliance. And I'm aware of 0 complaints or issues that have resulted from the current law as it stands. This is not changing the current law other than expanding it to more schools.
Well, those are some outstanding institutions we have in this state, LSU, Grambling, Southern, et cetera. But I'm a proud product of one of those private institutions, Dillard University. So I'm just very proud to let my colleagues know that there are other outstanding institutions throughout this state that are doing some great things. Did you know?
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Newell for a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Vice Chairman Duplessis. I've been reading this bill and listening, and some comments have muddied the water, so I need some clarity for myself. First of all, your bill is only asking the institutions to add a signature to the student ID, correct?
That's correct.
And did you know that most institutions, when a student does not register for the following semester, that ID card can't be used on campus? So they can't use that ID to check out a book out the library if they have not registered for school.
Sounds about right.
Okay, so, but that's not what your bill is concerning, correct?
Correct.
Your bill also does not concern voting twice, does it?
No.
But did you know?
I am opposed to anything
illegal. Because did you know there are safeguards in place for voting twice?
Yes.
And did you know that 52 United States Code 1033 subsection E provides for a $10,000 fine and or up to 5 years imprisonment if you are found to have voted twice? Did you know?
I do now.
Okay, and you can use did you know that you can use a passport to vote?
I would deem that to be a generally recognizable ID.
A hunting or fishing license to vote, especially in our great state of the sportsmanship. You can use those licenses to vote too, correct?
Generally recognizable ID, I would think you can use those.
Because it has a picture and a signature, which
Yes.
makes it a generally recognizable ID.
That's right.
Is that about right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm just trying to be clear because most of the statements that were made are very contrary to what this bill is trying to do, and it's bringing our attention in the area where this is not trying to go, and in the area that we don't have issues with as a state. So I'm just trying to get some clarity before I decide to vote yes on this bill, because I think it's a great bill and it allows our students to have the ability to vote without having the extra burden of having to pay for an ID. Because as we know, most students, did you know most students don't have jobs, unemployment, and can't afford that extra cost of an ID when they already have one that we could accept.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you
Newell.
very much,
Thank you.
Representative Duplessis.
Thank you.
Representative Gaines for a question.
Representative Duplessis, I appreciate you bringing this bill. Now, just for clarification, this bill was, I passed this bill 4 years ago at the request of the students of LSU.
Unanimously.
Yeah, right. at the request of the students at LSU, to encourage student participation in voting, because college students' voter participation was low in Louisiana, so that was a way to encourage college students to vote. Matter of fact, it was not only did the president of LSU come and testify for the bill, the Secretary of State came and testified for the bill. So, and you're only seeking to enhance that and expand that to cover the college students that are Louisiana citizens that do not go to public schools, that go to private schools, correct?
Correct.
And you want to uniformly give them that privilege, the same privilege that students who go to public schools are afforded, correct?
Correct.
And you're not, neither you or I are aware of any type of fraud that has occurred because of students fraudulently voting.
Zero.
Thank you.
Question on the bill, Representative Bill Wheat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Duplesis. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the state of Louisiana, if you have a valid driving license and you move out of state, that you have like 30 days to surrender that. It no longer becomes a valid ID. And if you don't, there's actually some repercussions of you not taking that action. In your bill, if someone's issued an ID under the circumstances that we're talking about, and they're issued it for like 6 years or 4 years, however long the bill says, and they move out of state, are they required to report back, and is there consequences if they do not do that?
I think that would be up to the university, but I don't know why that would be such a requirement. But I think that would be something that would be up to the university, because again, this is it wouldn't be a state ID. That would be up to the university, and I'm not aware of such a requirement.
And this is not talking about private or public here. This is talking about in general.
Right.
If someone was to take that ID and it is no longer a valid ID, like we consider a Louisiana driving license to be a valid ID after a certain period of time they move out of state, why would that type of ID not be subjected to the same scrutiny of being non-valid and take some enforcement action if they don't do that? You see where I'm going with it?
Yeah, but I think a state driver's license is just different than a student ID for various reasons. I mean, you have to perform certain tests and you have to show a certain level of competency, and it's state issued. So I don't think that a state ID, a state issued driver's license, and a student ID are the same.
Except if we use it for the same purpose. If we're taking and using that ID to vote with, then both of those IDs are being now used for the same purpose. One may be a valid, one may be invalid because of the proper time that has expired since it should have been surrendered.
Well, if that's I mean, look, that's I guess a well thought out question. I understand the comparison, but again, I think it's still kind of going further off into an area that this bill doesn't quite envision. If you want to add a provision that says that these licenses have to be surrendered, I'm open to considering that. But again, I haven't moved out of the state long enough to ever, or I've never changed my domicile to know that I had to turn in my ID. So I don't know much about that requirement. But you know, that would be, it's already been stated that this is a mandate, and to put another burden on the schools to say if a students leave colleges every day.
Sure.
Students drop out, they graduate, so to say now you have to turn in your ID, otherwise you're going to be penalized. That, you know, that's just going too far.
Thank you very much.
Question on the bill, Representative Villio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Duplesis, can you clarify something?
I'm sorry, Representative Villio, I was...
That's okay, thank you. In answer to, I believe it was Representative Bacala, when you were asked who asked you to bring the bill, I believe you said Tulane University.
No, I said they asked me to make the amendment.
Okay.
From 4 years to 6 years.
Okay,
some students asked me to bring the bill.
That's what I wanted to clarify. The
Yes.
administration of Tulane did not ask you to bring the bill, is that correct?
Correct. No, they asked me to make the change from 4 years to 6 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't think I said that, but I want to be, thank you for making that clarification, because I don't want anybody to think that. I was asked by students to bring this bill. I was asked by Tulane to make the change from 4 years to 6 years.
Thank you.
Question on the bill, Representative Horton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How you doing?
Good.
Is there any other college that currently issues a 6-year ID?
I don't know.
Why would a community college, a technical school that's a 2-year school, need a 6-year ID?
You know,
What's the purpose?
that is actually a great question. I'd be willing to make an amendment, but I think part of the thinking that could apply in the 6 years, it would just be giving them more time. So even though you're in a 2-year college, that doesn't mean you're going to finish in 2 years. So
Well,
it would last. That's how long it would last.
I just don't see the point. I mean, that's just me. I don't see the
understand.
need, especially for a community technical school. I really don't. And I know that they issue updated IDs because, you know, they have to validate that they are registered with that school. And I don't know why they can't just do that with a 4-year ID, just extend it to year by year.
Well, I think by doing that, you're putting more of a burden on them. If you're asking them to issue more IDs, then that's more of a burden on the schools. So giving them more time helps them.
Okay. I appreciate you, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Gadberry for a question.
I just have a clarification.
Yes.
Don't most universities issue an ID to someone each year or each semester if they happen to come in at mid-semester?
I think it varies. I think it varies from school to school. So some schools may issue. I think it varies from school to school. Some may do it each semester. Some may do it each year. Some may do it once upon enrollment, and they just update it every. I don't know. I think it varies. And then because technology is changing.
When I went to Louisiana Tech, they issued every fall. If you're a continual student, you got one every fall because your picture changed. I mean, your facial. I still have my ID from 1974, and it looks nothing like what I look like today. So I can't use that as a form of identification. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Representative Bagley for a question.
Oh, mercy.
Shut up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I just wanted to be straight that getting a 6-year ID does not qualify you to vote on its own. You still
I'm sorry?
Getting a 6-year ID does not qualify you to vote on your own. You have to get go to the area and qualify, register to vote. Having that ID is not a valid registration. It
Absolutely.
only says that's who you are.
You still have to be registered to vote.
And the 6 years that you're asking actually puts the burden on the colleges that issue that, because they're the ones that will have to, if this person uses it and they shouldn't, the college is the one's going to lose money. I'm not sure why a college would want to do that, but that's their choice. I think there was some misconception that we were going to register to vote with this. I'm just trying to get it straight.
No registration doesn't change anything. You know, there's 0 reports of fraud. I think it's a good bill.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you for your answers. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Wait, question. No more questions.
All right, to the floor on the bill, Representative Bacala.
Members, I think the most important thing we should do in debate is seek accuracy in the facts. And I initially had some reservations about the bill because of the ID expiration. I reached out to LSU as this debate was going on, and I think everybody ought to know how LSU handles it as an institution. An example. An LSU issues an identification card that has no expiration date printed on the card. Everything that ID card is used for is it's scanned. So at the time that it is scanned, a determination is made whether the ID is valid on campus. So if you go to to wherever, the library, the union, there's a scanning of that card to determine if it is valid or not. That's the only way to determine whether it is expired or unexpired. but in fact that card will typically remain with you. It's yours to keep forever. So I'm not standing up here to do anything but to clarify the typical, I think, probably what a student ID card looks like and what it feels like. So just again, in not wanting to make a statement from the floor, I come to the microphone to share that information with you that I learned in conversations with LSU representatives. Thank you.
To the floor on the bill, Representative McGee.
Members, I'm rising in support of the bill for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think if you're a conservative, I was raised to believe that we wanted IDs at the polls. We really did. That's all I've heard. I've never heard a specification on a driver's license, blah, 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 blah. I was raised that we wanted people to identify a face with a name and a signature. If you work under that guideline, this bill accomplishes greater access to identifications at the polls. So I think it's in that same narrative. As far as 4 to 6 years, I'm going to say this as respectfully as I can. If you've been to college in the last 10 to 20 years, you know that nobody goes to school for 4 years anymore. It is completely ridiculous to keep a 4-year. In fact, if we're going to be honest, the schools do not want you to go there for 4 years. They're going to try to make it as hard as they possibly can to graduate in 4 years so they can get another at least 1 year of tuition out of you, if not 2 years of tuition out of you. So that's the reality. And if you're worried about somebody who's not registered at the school anymore using this ID, let me tell you something else. The year you're going to leave is after your freshman year. So under the current law, you go to LSU, you flunk out, and you still got an ID for 3 more years to go to the library and read under Tony's questioning about it. My point being is, it's not in year 4, 5, and 6 that you're going to worry about somebody not being at the school anymore. It's actually between year 1 and 2. That's how that will actually work. So there's really no reason to get rid of the 6-year requirement. You're not protecting anything. You're not doing anything other than making some poor student have to spend time of his life out to go back and get his license, get another identification card for 2 more additional years as he slogs through trying to get his class. Because what happens is they don't offer you all the classes anymore for you to take. So you got to play the game with them and find out when you can get it. So in the midst of all of that, he's also going to have to go to the student union and get a new ID. It's ridiculous and silly to think this. I get it. It's election season and everybody's nervous about something, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with the bill in its current form at 6 years. It makes sense. It's pro-students. It's pro-ID at the polls. I really believe we should pass this bill in its current form. And with that, members, I sit down. Thank you.
Representative Ivey for the floor.
All right. I'm going to rise in support of the bill as it currently postures as well. So, and the reason why I want to come up is to provide clarification. I was able to get with staff and discuss some of the details. One of my concerns, based on the section that stated, was, is this a possibility for someone to try to avoid having to sign the affidavit attesting to who they are and somehow avoid committing voter fraud by providing matching ID with their face and the signature. But I was able to validate that they're in Title 18, Section 562, Title 18, Section 1461.2, about someone who is not the actual individual on the rolls and those penalties and such. So I do rise in support. There's also no requirement, as I can understand in the law, that requires an ID not to be expired or have an expiration date on it. Therefore, I don't believe it's relevant whether or not these 6 years or 4 years. I don't believe that's a relevant issue one way or the other. So with that, I will be done as well.
All right, there are no more questions on the bill. Representative Plessis, want to close?
Yeah, members, I always appreciate a healthy discussion. I try to do my best to answer questions to the best of my ability. I want to thank everybody for your questions. Thank you, Representative McGee and Representative Ivey. 4 years ago, this very same legislation passed both chambers unanimously. I understand where we are. We got a big election coming up. There's a lot of discussions around voter fraud and vote. This is a pro-voter ID bill. This is a pro-voter ID bill. Thank you for your time. I hope that you ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you.
Representative Duplessis moves final passage of the bill. All those in favor vote yea. Those opposed vote nay. The clerk will open the machines. Member, vote your machines. Vote your machines, members. Green, yes. Wright, yes. Hooval, yes. Hughes, yes. Through voting? All right. Close them up. 73 yeas, 20 nays, and the bill is finally passed. Representative Duplessis moves to adopt the title, moves to reconsider the vote by which the bill was finally passed, and lay that motion on the table without objection. So open it up for co-authors. Vote your machines for co-authors, members. Co-authors. Willard, yes. Through voting, members? All right. Close them up. 24 co-authors.